Hi everyone, welcome to Monday Match Analysis. Today's episode is a conversation with the great Hall of Famer, author of the book The Greatest Tennis Matches of All Time, writer for tennis.com, Steve Flink. We get into an old classic match that's worth reliving. I gave you a couple matches and I said, Steve, which one of these classic matches that some of my followers on Twitter have recommended to me, which one of these grabs your eyes? And you went with, I think there were two options, but one of them you went with was the 1984 French Open final between John McEnroe and Ivan Lendl. Without giving away too much, because I want to keep the suspense for those who don't know what happened in this match. Why was that your pick?
Well, now that's the problem is I don't want to give away. I know you want to keep the suspense of the match. Let's put it this way. It was a pivotal match in each of their careers for very different reasons, which is why I liked it. And also because it was so closely contested. It was in their rivalry. It was definitely the best match of their rivalry in my mind by far. They had another one once in Dallas, very close one in Dallas at WCT finals. But I would put this one at the top of their list. Most of the times when they met in majors, tended to be one-sided one way or another. This one was the exception, and it had dramatic overtones for both players. So that's why I picked it. I also thought there was a pretty darn good level of play, all things considered, at different stages of the match from both players.
Absolutely. It was good quality tennis, but there was so much in the lead up to this. The stakes were so high for both players. We'll get into both. And then even in the aftermath, this was arguably a turning point in both of their careers. But let's start with the broadcast, because I just got finished watching this match. And one of the first things.
Which network, which version did you get? The American NBC?
Yep, I got NBC. Okay. Dick Enberg and Bud Collins, two people who are dearly missed in the tennis community, right?
Well, two people that I knew very well, especially Bud. But I did know Dick as well. And interestingly enough, when you mentioned the Hall of Fame, we had a dinner in 2017, the year that I was fortunate enough to be inducted. And they always do a dinner at the end of the U.S. Open, and it's in New York. And they often would get a prominent host. And Dick hosted the dinner in September of 2017, and then a few months later, he died in his home. It was very sad. He seemed to have so much vitality when I saw him, and he reminded me of the old Dick Enberg. So, yeah, we're sad that both of them are gone. Bud left us the previous year.
Yeah, they were fantastic on this match, and I could see why they're so sorely missed.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. They were awfully good. They were awfully good consistently. I think they respected each other. They didn't step on each other's toes. They had different strengths, totally different personalities. I thought it was a nice blend, and they really liked each other a lot off the air as well. And that came into play when they worked.
That helps for sure.
Yeah.
So the big storyline coming in, I'd say the number one is John McEnroe hasn't lost a match in 1984.
Right. Correct.
He is, to this day, is it fair to say this is the greatest start in the history of the sport?
Well, it was. I would say that Novak Djokovic did slightly surpass him. It's a very similar thing. The similarity was all the way up to the French. There were interesting parallels. But this certainly was the greatest start of anybody up until Djokovic in 11. And it's very comparable start, and pretty hard to do this, to come into the French Open unbeaten.
Right. It was a 42-match win streak for McEnroe, 6 titles, 39-0 on the season. So he had previously won the year-end championship. What was it called? The Volvo Indoors or something like that.
The Masters.
Volvo Masters, right.
Yeah.
So he had won that the year prior. It was 42 matches in a row. For Lendl, the story was, well, he hadn't won his first major yet, and he had 39 career titles. That's I couldn't believe that. And the only person who comes to mind is maybe someone who he wound up coaching later. I had to look up Andy Murray. How many?
Well, there, now you got it.
Not even close, though.
because here's the thing. Here's what's fascinating. Murray had lost his first 4 finals, and he broke through with Lendl coaching. Lendl coming into this match, we're not going to say who's won it yet, but
Right.
coming into this match, he had lost the finals of the 82 and 83 U.S. Opens to Connors. He'd lost to, and then he had lost the 81 French final to Borg and the 83 Australian to Wielander. So a couple of Swedes, the 2 great Swedes, and Jimmy Connors twice at the Open. So he'd lost 4 finals, and he had sort of been developing somewhat unfairly the reputation of somebody who couldn't win when the chips were down. He couldn't win it when it counted. Ivan could win WCT tournaments, Masters titles, a lot of borderline majors, but not the very biggest at the Grand Slam events. So this was the reputation he was carrying into this match with John McEnroe.
If you were to editorialize that, what was going on with Ivan? Was it just bad luck? I mean, 4 finals, or was there something mental there?
Well, it different factors. 1981, he loses in 5 sets to Borg on clay, and Bjorn up until then was the greatest clay court player of all time until he surpassed by Rafael Nadal. So that one, what can you say? Debut was a pretty good debut to go down in 5. He did have some difficult moments in the 2 Connors finals at the U.S. Open. First one, I thought he was quite nervous, and he'd had a better year up until then, and Jimmy outplayed him. The second one, he had a chance to go 2 sets to 1 up, had a set point in the 3rd set, double faulted, and collapsed after that. And then Wielander, what can you say? Mats just adapted better to the grass, I think, to beat Ivan in Australia. So it was different factors, but he definitely didn't do himself full justice. Somewhere in the line there, take the Borg one away. But
Right.
Somewhere in the other 3 finals, he should have won at least one of those.
Yeah, I mean, just for some perspective, just comparing him to Andy Murray, Murray had won 23 career titles, including Olympics, before he won the U.S. Open, and Lendl, again, was at 39. The head-to-head between McEnroe and Lendl was 10-8 in favor of John at this point. Lendl had gotten the better of him early on, but then McEnroe started really beating Ivan on a regular basis.
Exactly. That's what made this rivalry so interesting. They each went on some tears against each other. And there were stages where they were dominant. And Ivan had been very dominant. I think won 7 in a row one stage before this. But earlier this year, leading up to this match, John had some very decisive wins over Ivan on the road to Roland Garros in that 84 season.
The play styles are incredibly contrasting and different. What is immediately striking about Lendl is just how heavy he hits the ball, especially for his time, right? The forehand is massive. He had developed this topspin backhand. And McEnroe, of course, I covered him in last Monday. He just had incredible hands, loved to get to the net and to use his touch and his feel.
Yeah, very well described. I mean, the thing is that you mentioned Lendl. I mean, he was sort of the transformational. He, to me, was the most influential player in the sense of how players performed after him stylistically. There's the idea of a pretty big serve that could set up the inside-out forehand that was explosive that you just described. And then the backhand topspin was still relatively flat. He hit through it beautifully. This was not a topspin, a Bjorn Borg type topspin or a loopy shot. He really hit through that backhand. So he was so forceful from the baseline and he was so fit. He just was, he was also known for that, going into the gym and doing all the hard work so that he could wear guys down in long matches. So it was an interesting contrast with John with all that natural flair and talent. And you wouldn't have thought that John would be necessarily comfortable on clay. And there are a lot of stages in his career when he wasn't. But this particular year, he's playing the best clay court tennis of his life. And that was true coming into this final with Ivan as well.
It was also part of the stakes because an American hadn't won the French Open since 1955.
Tony Trabert. That was Trabert winning his second in a row. Absolutely right. So,
Right.
Well, exactly. And John, I'm sure, was fully aware of that. And I think Tony, who'd been his Davis Cup captain, would have been happy to see John succeed him. I think he was very hopeful that John, given the way he was playing coming in, was going to win this match. So there were all these things floating around the perimeters of this match, Gillen, and it's
Yes.
hard not to give it away. But this was such a gripping clash, absolutely gripping.
And the last thing I'll just throw in on top of all this, McEnroe, number 1 in the world, Lendl, number 2 in the world. Dick Enberg said it felt like a heavyweight fight before the first serve. And right before the first serve, McEnroe started feuding with the photographers. Literally,
Yeah.
not a single ball had been hit. And
Right,
apparently,
right.
this was a back and forth throughout the whole tournament. What was going on with
Well,
McEnroe and the photographers?
Yeah, I was there. None of us could understand it. I was watching it with Curry Kirkpatrick, the Sports Illustrated writer, and we were just shaking our heads. But that was John. Sometimes it was almost as if he needed this kind of altercation, even if it seemed to be manufactured. He seemed to need it to get his juices flowing, to get himself. You wouldn't have thought so. You wouldn't have thought that he would want to waste that kind of energy. But I think this match meant a lot to him. He really wanted to beat Lendl. He knew he had kind of owned him along the way to Roland Garros. So he was maybe a little bit overwrought. He really wanted to peak on this occasion. So the tension more than surfaced. It spilled over, and in some ways, maybe it wasn't a bad thing that he got that out of his system initially before the match with the way you described.
Yeah, he did get off to a really good start. The first break of serve was at 2-3 Lendl serving, and at 15-all, he missed an easy overhead. It was 15-30 at that point. The game went to deuce, and then a couple strong returns by McEnroe followed both of his returns up to the net, and really jumped on Lendl in this match early on.
Yeah, which is the brand of clay court tennis he played that whole year. Very little compromising. He played not that differently from the way you would have played on hard court. So, a little bit of give and take, a little bit of some compromising, but not a lot. And it's unnerving for someone like Lendl, who really much preferred the rhythmic. He would have much preferred to play Connors on clay, for instance, or even Mats Wilander. As much as he respected Mats as a clay court player, the matchup itself, I think, was more comfortable for him, and he was playing the kind of clay court tennis that he wanted, and long rallies and waiting for his openings to hit a penetrating forehand, and that's how he wanted to play conventional clay court tennis. This was not conventional. McEnroe was turning it almost into a fast court contest on a clay court.
And in the beginning, his first serve was firing as well. So first set, 6-3 to McEnroe. Second set, it's more of the same, and it becomes 5-1 at one point.
Yeah.
Some things one thing I wrote down, just in my notes while I was watching, is sometimes Lendl just seemed very uncreative on his passing shots. No lobs, no short angles, a lot down the line. And even when he went cross court, just wasn't finding the sharp angle, was focusing a little bit too much on his pace, and McEnroe was having his way at the net. I
loved Lendl. I loved the way he played. I loved his professionalism. I loved the fact that he went on court with game plans, clear game plans. He used to keep notebooks before he started hiring coaches like Wojciech Feedback from Poland, and later Tony Roach, his most important coach, who was from Australia. And then they did a lot of the work for him. He didn't have to do the same work, but he would literally keep notebooks on his opponents. My gripe was that sometimes he was too programmed, and he wouldn't. So the kinds of criticisms you're making right now, that maybe it didn't sink into his system enough. I've got to change. I've got to do something different. I've got to mix it up more. It can't be so predictable. He just prided himself on the fact that he had the plan going out there, and he was going to stick steadfastly to the way he thought he should play. So I agree with you, and that's how I remembered at the time. And I've seen the tape. I haven't watched it actually for a long time. I deliberately didn't watch it before we came on tonight, because I preferred to sort of just remember it. But I have clear recollection sitting in that press section behind the court, as it was in those days at Roland Garros. And I remember thinking, boy, Ivan he's bottled himself up here. He's boxed himself in. And if he doesn't make some adjustments here, he's gonna be off this court in a hurry. Right.
It was not a match through two sets. It was not a match that you were expecting to turn into a classic match, right? You were probably thinking, if anything, wow, I mean, John McEnroe is just a train that can't be stopped right now through two sets.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were thinking. And of course, in the back of our minds, I think some of us in that press section, the only thing we thought might get in his way was his psyche, was just what you described, the agitation right before the match. getting all out of sorts with photographers before you've even played a point. And there was always that potential, and you always knew that John, something might be triggered in him that where he would lose it. And John was different from say Pancho Gonzalez, who could lose his temper, and there were times when John could make the resurrection, could come back from an eruption, but not always. And so there was always this danger.
I was going to ask you about that exactly. I mean, I do have some quotes from McEnroe. In the third set, he called himself a stupid, moronic idiot.
Yeah.
And I mean, he would yell these things after missing a first serve. That's the kind of thing any junior coach is like, do not tell your opponent that you're struggling like this. But McEnroe didn't seem to follow those rules. But
no, I don't. I see your point. I'm not sure he was not necessarily worried about showing that to Ivan, but it said something about him. The part that baffled me was, why are you doing this to yourself? I mean, yeah, be a perfectionist, but not to the point where it's so negative that you're chiding yourself when you've been playing a brilliant match. I mean, you have to cut yourself a little bit of slack. That's what amazed me more was, come on, you played an almost perfect match. Go easy on yourself. You know, don't lose it over something like that.
Yeah. And the thing that he did lose it on, and this is really what turned in the third set, is McEnroe could not make a first serve. He was literally hovering around 30% in that set. And I don't think Lendl is the kind of player that you can get away with that against, because his ground strokes are so heavy.
Absolutely, but particularly on clay. You know, John maybe on the faster court, who had a very good second serve, still going to get in behind it, and maybe he could get away with a low first serve percentage, but not on the red clay at Roland Garros. And it was granted it was a hot day, but that was going to catch up to him. Inevitably, it would.
So let's go. I'm just going to go to 4-5 here, just so we can wrap up this third set.
Okay.
His percentage in the first was officially 36%, but McEnroe serving at 4-5. And at this point, I think Lendl corrects what I didn't like about what he was doing in the first two sets. He mixes in lobs, and he begins to find his cross-court angle more often. At this game in 4-5, a great lob at love all to start, and then a great cross-court short angle backhand return. That makes it love 30. Lendl misses a routine forehand volley. 15-30, a massive backhand return by Lendl off of McEnroe's signature slice serve out wide.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, now when Lendl was like Borg, if he read that, granted, Borg had the difficulty of having a two-hander, so he really had to read it early, or else he was dragged wide, and with a two-hander, it's pretty difficult to make those returns. But the similarity was, if they could get onto that, they could use the angle to their advantage, and they had openings to either rip it down the line or go sharp cross-court. And Ivan, sooner or later, he was going to get onto that serve on a big point, and that was it.
Absolutely. And on set point, another return just hammered by Lendl, came in behind his backhand, and McEnroe couldn't make the pass. So that is 6-4 for Lendl in the third set. In the fourth set was...
You think about it, that was a clutch game from Lendl in a way, mm-hmm. because if John holds there and holds one more time, maybe, even though he's not as dominant as the first two sets, maybe he wins a tiebreak and he's off the court with a straight set victory. But that was he still was playing well, and he just needed those two holds to get into a tiebreak conceivably to try to finish off the match there. So I thought that was a very good effort from Lendl to lift his game at that juncture.
I agree. And McEnroe also, he did taste it a couple times. He broke serve early in this set. So he felt that, okay, I'm up 2 sets and a break. And I think that might've made it more painful that it slipped away, as opposed to Lendl just running away with the third set more easily.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's true. But I think that the key thing was Lendl, by early in the third, he was returning better. He was gonna break him. It was gonna happen sooner or later, and John knew that. And then John wasn't automatically able to jump on Ivan's serve as easily as he had on Ivan's second serve, the way he had the first 2 sets. So the complexion was changing a little by then.
Now in the fourth set, McEnroe's first serve does not get any better. He's still not making it. He's still getting very frustrated with himself. The biggest difference, what kept John in this fourth set for a while here, is that he was breaking serve. It was really, there were tons of breaks in this fourth set.
Oh, listen, he had 4-2 in that fourth set. That was he was agonizingly close at that point. You know, a couple more holds from there, and he's got it in 4 sets. That was a big opening for him. But I thought Lendl played awfully well to come back from that deficit and win that set. In the end, very deservedly. You know, he lost only one more game from there, and that was very disappointing for McEnroe, I think, to not be able to close it from 4-2.
McEnroe yelled after missing one of his first serves, serving for the set, 1 out of 50. So he continued to get really frustrated there.
Yeah,
and one thing I noticed also is that McEnroe's backhand was very strong in the early going, but the heaviness of Lendl's ball, as long as it were deep in the court, started to frustrate Ivan. And I wonder if Ivan started to frustrate McEnroe with the heaviness of his cross-court forehand. And I wonder if, as McEnroe progressed in his career and more players started to play like Lendl, how much of a problem did that almost half volley from the baseline style get?
Well, I think he had issues with that earlier in his rivalry with Lendl, not really just on clay, but I remember even at an example being the 1982 U.S. Open where Ivan just bludgeoned John in the semis. John had been in the finals of Wimbledon against Connors, losing in 5. He really wanted to win his 4th Open in a row, and Lendl denied him that chance with a straight set win in the semifinals, and it was just brute force. And yes, when he could pin him back there with the depth and pace that he had, John trying to half volley the ball back or else forced to compromise a little bit and give a little ground, which then he was even worse off if he did that. So he really had to try to stay up on the baseline and flick those balls back, but it wasn't easy. It was a lot of pace coming at him off both sides. There's no doubt that the Lendl ground game was superior to John's. John had to find a way to get in. There's no doubt about it, and mix it up from the baseline, but then work his way in as soon as possible.
So Lendl breaks for the set at 4-5 once again, and they head for a 5th. Do you remember at that time, what were you thinking? Did you have kind of an inclination of how that 5th set was going to go?
I still thought it was almost a toss up. Obviously, Lendl had all this momentum, and you felt like I didn't feel like it was in the bag for Lendl because John had lost 2 sets in a row. I still thought he was going to give it a real go, but I remember just being impressed that Lendl had worked his way into the 5th, and I just felt like I felt like in the end it was probably going to come down to one crucial break by then. Lendl was holding serve, was doing a better job holding serve despite some difficulties in the 4th, and I felt like his overall game was he had picked up his level considerably.
And he certainly did. McEnroe finally had an acceptable serving set in the 5th. So John started holding as well because I don't think he was making as many firsts as he would like, but he was making enough firsts where it wasn't around 30% like it was in the 3rd and the 4th set. So you did see a lot of holds.
Keep in mind, Gill, that also the other factor was that he realized that Lendl had found his range on the return. Sometimes the guy's first serve percentage goes down because the opponent, it's like people serving against Novak right now. The pressure is really on. There are times when you'll see Federer's first serve percentage dip a lot if Djokovic is returning really well because you're feeling the pressure to get 70 or 75% of your first serves in and you start pressing.
Absolutely. I think that was a big part of it. I mean, Lendl really does remind me of what I'll say 3 players in the modern game, Nadal, Thiem, and Wawrinka. What those 3 can do, taking big cuts off of the second serve on clay. I think Lendl was doing a lot of that back then.
Yeah, he's probably. I think the team comparison is a really good one. I think because Thiem being and Stan too, they were their one-handed backhands. There is some resemblance to Lendl in that sense, and I kind of like the team comparison because team also relies on a really heavy ground game, a pretty big first serve. I think there's some definite resemblance there.
So, and I also noticed that Lendl's cross-court backhand pass, even though he was known for his forehand, that was the pass that was working over and over again by the end of this match. I mean, it was really giving McEnroe trouble. And even when John put Lendl on the run on the forehand side, you know, that was your traditionally dangerous swing. So, and then.
But you see, the thing is that Ivan actually, the reason I think that was so effective, he had a great down the line backhand, and John knew that. And I think in some, there are a lot of times he could get into a rhythm on his backhand down the line and hit that shot a lot, passing shots and in rallies. But it was very wise for him to start going for the angled cross-court passes.
And mixing in the lobs to keep McEnroe from really getting on top of the net where I think he likes to be, opens up those angles even more effectively.
Yeah, and I think he felt by the fifth, he probably felt like John was maybe a little fatigued. Certainly was mentally fatigued, but I think Lendl probably believed that John was physically fatigued as well. He may well have been right.
So let's jump to 5-6. McEnroe is serving. He misses a volley on the first point, so love 15. Then an insane down the line forehand pass that Lendl scraped off the ground. McEnroe just pops up the next volley. Easy pass for Lendl. That makes it love 30. Serve and volley on love 30 by McEnroe puts away the overhead, 15-30. Another serve and volley, and again, Lendl hammers this return. So much pace that McEnroe just blocks back the next volley, and Lendl passes easily on the next ball.
That was a familiar routine in their matches, when especially when Lendl was playing well. And obviously, the guys who great counterattackers like him, they know you don't always have to pass them off the first time. You set it up. Use your pace or your dipping pass to set up an easier pass. Lendl was very adept at doing that.
McEnroe got it to 30-40, saved it at 15-40. And then 30-40, he has a makeable volley.
Oh, very makeable. Very makeable. Yeah, that was actually, I remember all of us, we kind of went, oh, I mean, we were stunned because we thought he had the point one. But again, that was a lot of pressure by then. You know, you're serving to stay in the match. It's so much tension. Lendl has taken the third and fourth sets. You're still fretting about why you didn't close them out sooner. And that was understandable, I guess, by that stage that he'd make that one last fatal mistake. But Gill, let me just say this in terms of the match itself. You probably know that, you probably heard McEnroe discuss it. He's mentioned it about 1 million times since that day. It was a haunting, tormenting loss, because that would have been his one French Open. Now, he never won the Australian either, so he wouldn't have had a career slam. He didn't play the Australian much, but it still was a title. He really, I don't think it bothers him that much that he didn't win Australia, but it really irks him that this one didn't go his way, and he blames himself. He's very hard on himself, to get back to our earlier discussion about how he was carrying on. But here's what bothers me about the way that match is discussed. Ivan Lendl, as we talked about earlier, lost the 4 finals, 2 to Connors, 1 to Wielander, 1 to Board. Now he's finally on the board. How does he do it? He comes from 2 sets down to beat John McEnroe, who he hasn't beaten all year, John McEnroe, who's been unbeaten all year. And Ivan manages to topple him from 2 sets down, and all people could talk about, they sort of took John's version of the match, meaning he choked it away. I don't think that's fair. The last 3 sets were all very, very competitive. In that third set, at one stage, it was 3-all, 15-40. There were stages there in the third where I thought John could do it. Then 4-2 in the fourth, as we discussed. Yep. Third, okay, not great chances. Great chance for John, but good comeback from Ivan. And then the fifth, there was a stage where it was 3-all, 15-40. That's what I'm really talking about. So he had openings, chances, but Ivan competed so well, and I think he should have been given more credit. If he was the one who was being castigated or criticized for sure, but why can't Ivan win the big one? So he finally wins a big one, and all everybody wanted to talk about was what happened to McEnroe. How could he squander the 2-set lead? Well, he didn't collapse and go down 2-1 and 2 in the last 3 sets and get crushed. All those sets were very competitive. starting with the third set that you described well, and with John serving to stay in it at 4-5. Very hard fought fourth, and a hard fought fifth goes right down to the wire. So I really think that Lendl, to this day, I don't think he's been given the credit he deserved, and it led to 7 more Grand Slam titles for a total of 8 for Ivan. And so he really sort of altered his career arc by doing all this. I mean, up until then, a great player who hadn't won the big ones, but that really freed him up. And obviously he got to 8 straight U.S. Open finals in one stage, won only 3. But I'm just saying he became a better big match player. And I think that victory is one that he should cherish. And it should be, I wish the emphasis were more on that he won it than John lost it.
I've heard McEnroe say, I'm still not over it. He called, in his autobiography, he said it was his most bitter defeat. But I completely agree with you, especially that 5th set is the main one that I circled, where McEnroe had an adrenaline rush at 3-all. You mentioned 15-40. Lendl played some fantastic tennis to dig out of that.
He did. So I mean, so you look at it, and John had chances, but that's also proof that Lendl was fighting hard and not giving in, not ceding any ground, and also playing a much higher level than he had in the first 2 sets. And I think the fact that he could beat a guy he hadn't beaten the whole year, who was also unbeaten by anyone that year up until that stage, and do it to collect your first major title, I think that was really commendable. And I've never understood why more writers and observers wouldn't look at it that way. And again, John, I perfectly understand that. If I'm in John's shoes, I would lament that loss the rest of my life too. And he has every right to be frustrated by it. And he played so brilliantly for 2 sets. But I think for neutral observers, it should be more of a lauding of Lendl. And yes, you can be critical of McEnroe. I mean, he didn't put the clamps down. He couldn't find a way to close it out. But a lot of that had to do with Lendl's clay court mastery too. Lendl was a great clay court player.
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of it. I think we ended up seeing that in Flushing a couple months later, right, when McEnroe beat Lendl in the U.S. Open final, got his revenge. So court speed was at play here. And you mentioned McEnroe kind of going against the grain in terms of how it's, I guess, easiest to play on clay.
Well, what we should also say is that he ends up the year, and it's very tricky when you look at the stats back then, because those January Masters were part of the previous. So in other words, he won the Masters in January of '85 to cap off an 82-3 season. So 3 losses in all of the '84 season. This was the first. He lost a VJ Armitage in Cincinnati over the summer, and then he lost a Davis Cup match in Sweden at the end of the year. That was it for the entire campaign. So it was a spectacular year. But retrospectively, it doesn't shock me that one of the losses would happen to be on clay, and it would be up against a player of, against Ivan Lendl, who was one of the great clay court players. So there's some logic to it, even though it was shocking that Lendl would do it from 2 sets down.
So there's 2 turning points that I think this match, at least statistically, signified. One, the Lendl-McEnroe head-to-head shortly after 1984 really turns in Ivan's favor, and Ivan wins 10 out of the last 11 against McEnroe. What do you feel happened in that matchup?
Well, I think that McEnroe, obviously that was his vintage peak year in '84. And after the '85 season, where he was slightly less great, not quite as prodigious as he'd been in '84, still great, but key match was the U.S. Open final. You mentioned the Open final of '84. They come back to the '85 U.S. Open final. And McEnroe got off to a good start and had 5-2, but he was exhausted from having a 5-setter with Wielander the day before. And Lendl came back and crushed him 7-6, I think 3-4 from there. It was straight sets. And I think that was a crucial win in their series. And then he just got back to sort of manhandling him from the baseline. And John wasn't really ever the same player after that, after things changed in '85. He had a little resurgence in '89, but Ivan was coming into some of his best seasons. Ivan's best seasons were '85, '6, '7, and he's still great, still awfully good in '88 and '89 as well. And meantime, John was never quite the same. I think he would admit that. And so that's partially what happened in the rivalry. But it was a fascinating rivalry, Gill, because as we said earlier, there just were fluctuations all the way through. Lendl for a while dominating John up in that period of, say, 81, 82, and then John turns it in 83 and 84, and it goes back Ivan's way in 85. It was pretty interesting to see the way they could, for brief stages, at certain stages, the way they could dominate each other.
Right. And to your point, McEnroe, after 84, after winning Wimbledon and the U.S. Open, he didn't win another slam. Lendl went on to win another 7. And his win percentage, 90% or above in 1985 through 87, which you mentioned were his strongest years.
Oh, those were great
Quite
years.
Quite the run.
Yeah, because he would, every year, he was always a big threat, especially, well, at 3 of the 4. And then, unfortunately for him, in that period, he lost 2 Wimbledon finals. It was tough for him he lost in 86 and 87 back-to-back to Becker and Pat Cash. So that was frustrating for Ivan, but he was winning some more French in that period. And then in the U.S. Open, he was in the midst of that streak, and he actually won it in 80. He defended it again after 85. He won it in 86 and 87, and then lost in the finals in 88. And that was his, and 89 to Becker. So he lost in tough matches in 88 and 89 to Wielander and Becker. But still, that was a great stretch, particularly 85, 6, and 7. Ivan was, those are the years of which he's most proud.
Yeah, Wimbledon to McEnroe is Wimbledon to Lendl is like the French to McEnroe. Both of those slams eluded those great players.
Yeah, I think what happened to Lendl, in my opinion, he would disagree with me, I'm sure, and he would have every right to. He's the one who played these matches. My feeling was, again, it was a certain rigidity. And what happened was he and his coach, Tony Roach, who was a great coach, they felt that Ivan should serve and volley really virtually every point on the grass, that he had to. The bad bounces in those days, that it was trickier, the courts were faster. I thought he could have tried a formula more like what we saw later from Courier and Agassi. Agassi in winning the title, Courier in 92, and Courier in reaching the final in 93. And they mixed it up. Jim, even more than Andre, really. Jim really mixed it up against Pete Sampras in 93 and served and volleyed on first and second serves selectively. And I thought that if Ivan would have stayed back behind more second serves, I honestly think he would have benefited. I know they would disagree, but I just thought it was too bad. Particularly, Becker played a great match against him in 86. There wasn't much he could have done. And Cash did play very, very well the following year, but I thought that was a match that Ivan could have won.
And
Ivan, it was a guy that you coming out there on paper, you thought he had a great chance. And I didn't think he did himself justice in that latter final against Cash.
You mentioned Jim Courier as well, and he's the one who broke the streak, or I should call it a drought, not a streak, for Americans at the French Open. 88? I know I have it written down.
Which
Courier wins the French.
Oh,
91.
91, yeah. He won it in 91 over Agassi, and then he defended it and won it again in 92 over Peter Korda, and then went for the hat trick and lost in 5 sets to Sergi Bruguera, which was a shame. He had a great chance up early in the 5th, and he couldn't close him out.
What was it about Courier that was different from all the Americans that preceded him and failed to win Roland Garros?
Jim was, obviously Chang was the one that first broke it in 89. Chang won in 89. But Jim was just, I think he was a great clay court player. He was influenced a lot by Lendl, I thought. I thought there were a lot, although he had a 2-handed backhand, that was the big difference between the two. He had the big serve, pretty big serve, and a great inside-out forehand, even more lethal than Lendl's, as hard as it is to imagine that. I think it was an even bigger shot. So I think he was almost equally good on clay and hard courts, and he adapted nicely on grass. And Jim was very disciplined, and was a great fighter. And with some luck, he would have come away with three French Opens in a row. He had to settle for 2.
Well, we're a couple of commentators now, good commentators now, John McEnroe and Jim Courier, right?
They are. That would be an interesting team now that you bring it up. They don't work together. They would be very good together.
But I don't know if we're ever going to get a chance to see it. They each have very good minds, and Courier, I honestly think he might be the best analyst out there. I've listed there's a lot of very, very good ones, and Gilbert and Cahill, and we could go down the list, and John himself is terrific. His brother Patrick is terrific, but I just think that Jim has there's a real depth to his insights, and he's a great analyst and has a very good mind. And I listened to his version. I thought they all did a great job on the Djokovic-Federer Wimbledon final that you and I have talked about so much last year. But I thought that Courier was just magnificent on his Tennis Channel call of that match with Brett Haber was exemplary.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I won't rank him because I'm very political in this.
Yeah,
area.
no, listen, I shouldn't either. I'm saying they're all A's. They're all A's.
Yes, they are. I agree. We're lucky.
We're talking about really, really small differences here. But
Yes.
I think that Courier, I guess what I'm getting at is Courier, I don't think is given as much, as many compliments for his commentary as he deserves. Everybody appreciates him and thinks he's very good, but I think
Yes.
he's outstanding commentator.
Well, this has been some great commentating on your part. Some really good insight on this match. Let's jump to 2020, where unfortunately we're not
Sure.
watching any live tennis. Do you have any viewpoints or predictions that are on your mind right now? And I know you were working on a piece for tennis.com before this, so feel free to share what you were working on as well.
Oh no, that was actually, I'm happy to share it. That was really a piece. I did a couple of pieces about some of the tournaments that we've lost during this period and the traditions that they had. One of them was the men's event in Houston, the U.S. clay courts, and the other was the women's event in Charleston, which originally started in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. They're both great, long-time, deeply appreciated events that have look like they're going to go by the wayside this year unless somehow the calendar opens up. So that was what I was writing about. But no, my thoughts are more, to get back to the big three, I guess, is that this will probably end up deny Federer his last great chance. In other words, Wimbledon being canceled, that was always going to be Roger's best opportunity, I think, to win a 21st major, and now possibly, although I would never count him out even when he's 45, but it may have been really bad luck for him that Wimbledon's canceled this year. And then depending on what happens with the French and whether the revised dates of playing in late September and October really happen, Rafa might miss out on a golden opportunity for number 13 in Roland Garros in his 20th major. And then Novak was the hottest, he was the best player. And he'd started the year by winning Australia. And, really ever since his resurgence in the spring of 18, he'd been the best player in the world. When he came back and won Wimbledon in the Open in 18, and he won Australia and Wimbledon. I mean, he was on a tear. He'd won the last two Australians. He'd won the last two Wimbledons, and he'd won one of the last two Opens. So he was really setting the pace, Novak Djokovic was. And there was every reason to believe that if we'd had a normal year here playing out the last three majors, that he was good for at least one, and I think probably two of those three. Now we may not have any of them played. I mean, Gill, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll get a U.S. Open because I don't know how they can feel if they discuss with Governor Cuomo or the health experts. Can you really be safe to put all those people in a 23,000 seat stadium or the other, an Armstrong or the grandstand or just the grounds and the food court, just big massive crowds floating around the Open. I don't know how you safely do that. So I'm worried that the year may well be gone.
Yeah, I'm not terribly optimistic either, and I think we'll have plenty of time to talk in the upcoming months and update our thoughts on this. I'm a little bit more optimistic about how the big three might rebound from this. I think.
I don't think it's that they won't rebound. I think Djokovic and Nadal will. I think it's a little harder for Roger, given the age difference. For him, if he was going to come back next year and be pushing on toward 40, getting toward his 40th, pretty hard to do. Not impossible because he's an amazing athlete and he's very young for his age and he moves incredibly well for his age. But no, it's not that I don't think they're going to do more, but those when you don't play those tournaments, you're missing tournaments when you're in. These are prime years and prime opportunities, and I'm saddened for all three that they lose out on that. They didn't lose to Dominic Thiem or the Tsitsipas or one of their rivals. They lost to a virus.
Yeah, that when you put it that way, it's that is unfortunate. That's not. But so many different aspects of this are unfortunate beyond tennis, really.
Of course.
Anyway, this was a lot of fun, and let's do it again. Hopefully, we don't have to do it 2 more times before we're talking about more recent tennis, we'll say. But this was still a lot of fun.
Listen,
I enjoyed it.
Thank you for going back. I thought it would be more fun for me, and it was, because I remember a lot of those points, and I have a photographic memory. A lot springs back to my mind immediately. But it was more fun to not actually go, having not watched the match for probably over 10 years, at least 10 years. I might have watched it 12 years ago. I might have gone back to the tape. So it was much more fun to sort of play off what you had just seen recently. You watched it on YouTube, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you saw the NBC version on YouTube. It was more enjoyable for me to do it that way, and I thank you for doing that. And it was fun to get your take on it as well.
Yes, certainly. It was cool. A lot of fun indeed, and we'll do it again soon. Thanks so much, Steve.
Okay, Gill. Thanks for having me on.
Have a good one.
You too.
Stay safe.
You as well.